Chapter 2. Pain. Reyes woke up slowly. He was in his old room back in the castle residency. Birds were singing joyfully just outside the window, welcoming in the dawn of the new day. This was truly a comfortable mattress. It was one of those expensive goose feather stuffed mattresses, and so much more restful than one that had been stuffed with just straw. During the night, a large dog, maybe owned by a servant or possibly even one of his father's hunting dogs, had come into his room and made itself at home on the bed. The dog evidently hadn't been happy to just share the bed. Instead it lay across him, large and heavy. The dog's weight had numbed a considerable part of his body and had, in part, been responsible for forcing Reyes to sleep at an awkward angle. Then there was the pain. Both his shoulder and ankle felt as if they'd been struck by a red-hot poker. Reyes assumed that they hurt so much because the weight of the dog had cut off circulation to those parts of his body. They weren't just numb, they hurt. He found it hard to believe that his body could hurt so much. There was also a sharp, searing pain in one of his wings. Reyes had never known about his wings when he had lived at the castle residency, but this anomaly didn't really bother him as he lay there trying to recover. It was normal for him to have wings, and it was normal for him to be living at the castle. Nothing else seemed important. The dog, perhaps sensing that Reyes was now awake, suddenly began to move. It jumped off the bed, pushing heavily against Reyes' injured wing as it did so. Slowly, as Reyes climbed further into true consciousness, the world of the comfortable mattress and the faithful hunting hound began to fade away. He dimly became aware of his actual surroundings. He was lying on an uncomfortable patch of slightly damp grass just outside the castle wall. His entire body was feeling numb because he had fallen 15, maybe even 20 feet out of the sky. His shoulder, foot and wing all hurt as much as they did because they had been struck by arrows. Even the bird song had faded. It had been replaced by loud music and cheering coming from somewhere beyond the wall of the castle. The dog that had spent the night lying across him coalesced into the form of a harpy. Reyes assumed that it had to be the girl who had landed by his side and had tried to tend to his wounds. For a moment, Reyes was a little confused. He was pretty sure that the harpy had died in a hail of arrows, so how had she been able to move just now? His answer came almost immediately. He was manhandled roughly and turned over onto his back and his damaged wing without any consideration to how much extra pain this might cause him. Then, whoever had rolled him over began to remove his bracelets. Reyes opened his eyes just a little to see an elf kneeling beside him. "Hello?" Reyes groaned weakly. For a split second the elf looked confused and worried. Then, in a panic, he let go of Reyes' arm and reached for a small dagger he was carrying. Reyes was so dazed that he almost didn't realise his danger in time. The elf stabbed down with the blade, aiming for Reyes' heart. Reyes tried his best to block the blow with his arm, but without thinking he blocked with the wrong arm. His injured shoulder screamed in pain and refused to cooperate. Reyes felt his arm collapse under the attack. It did, however, buy Reyes the vital second he needed to knock the elf's arm aside with his good hand. The elf brought the dagger down into the sod by the side of where Reyes lay. He didn't hesitate, but drew the dagger free immediately with the intention of trying a second time. Reyes had had enough. He extended the claws on his good hand and slashed almost blindly at the elf's neck, tearing out his assailant's throat in one swift, sudden movement. The elf seemed surprised more than anything. He let the dagger drop harmlessly to the ground and reached for his neck wound in shock. Then he began to choke, and shortly after he fell dead across Reyes' legs. Reyes used his good leg to kick the elf off him, and then he tried to sit up. He was still feeling numb all over, and any movement at all caused him pain. Nevertheless, he was able to get into a sitting position using his good arm to support him. He was very close to the moat. The scaling ladders that had been used to attack the castle were still in place. Judging by the angle of the sun, Reyes assumed that he must have been unconscious for at least 2, maybe even 3 hours. Already the majority of the army that had laid siege to the castle had moved on. They would have other targets to deal with today, be they local villages or the city of Lamington. Only those actually in the castle and those looting the dead were still nearby. There were a lot of dead. After the Hope had been sent into combat, the regular army must also join the fray, because, for all their being sent in after the Hope, there were more dead wearing blue uniforms than those wearing brown, yellow or sackcloths. There were a lot of dead harpies near him. The nearest one, the girl who had fallen across him and so protected him from the last volley of arrows, had been Nida. She had more than a dozen arrows protruding from her body. If she hadn't fallen across him, then he too would very likely be dead by now. Reyes looked at her sadly. He began to feel guilty. He had saved her life so she could die in this way? He stroked her jowl lovingly. and examined her beautiful body with regret. He would mourn for her later. Nida wasn't the only harpy to lose her life today. Even from where he sat he could see the crumpled forms of Caglin, Narleth and Lofgren, all fallen in an attempt to secure the battlement so that the defenders wouldn't be able to knock the ladders over. Reyes vaguely remembered Agnar assuring him that even in the hope, harpies would fly high over the battle. They weren't about to put themselves in danger on the say-so of some elven commander. Yes, well, it was clear how well that claim actually worked out in true life. At least he couldn't see the dead body of Agnar, not from where he sat anyway. There was still a chance that she had survived. Then there were the looters. Every battle had its fair share of looters. Usually they would be peasants that lived nearby, looking to claim whatever they could. In this case, though, the elven army seemed to have brought a large number of looters with them. They were scattered thinly about the field, helping themselves to anything the dead had carried. There were even carts following some of the more aggressive looters, those who were stripping the dead of their weapons and even their uniforms. The elf Reyes had just killed was just another looter. Indeed, there were many others not very far from where Reyes had fallen, all hard at work checking through the bodies. Either they hadn't seen Reyes kill their comrade, or they just didn't care. Somehow, Reyes doubted it was the prior. At least it seemed that none of the looters were about to come over here and seek vengeance for their friend. Nevertheless, Reyes was reluctant to take his eyes off them as he thought about tending to his wounds. The arrow that had struck his wing had definitely broken one of his bones. He thought he had heard the bone snap as it hit, but hoped it wasn't that bad. On the positive side, the arrow itself hadn't stuck into his wing, but had done its damage and either bounced off when it struck, or had since worked itself free. On the downside, a broken bone couldn't be mended with a simple heal spell. It needed to regenerate at the very least. Reyes had successfully cast Regenerate only once before when he had healed Nida's wing. But back then he had been able to concentrate on the spell with a clear head, and even then he hadn't been certain the spell would succeed. Now that he was in so much pain, he doubted he could concentrate enough to even begin the spell, let alone cast it successfully. He decided to move to his other wounds first. Maybe if he healed them, he would be able to concentrate enough to fix his wing. Tentatively, Reyes climbed to his knees and examined the arrow in his ankle. The damage didn't actually look all that bad. Admittedly, the arrow had gone right through his leg, piercing his calf muscle rather than the ankle itself, and it had missed the bone. The wound would probably give him a bit of a limp for a while, but he could fix that with a heal spell, once he removed the arrow. The biggest problem that lay before him was finding a way to remove it. His leg already felt as if it was on fire with pain. Any time he moved even the smallest of his toes, shivers of pain ran up the length of his leg. If he even so much as touched the arrow in his leg, the pain it brought seemed to explode 1,000-fold for a second, and then take a minute or two to subside back to its previous levels. As Reyes examined the arrow, he began to think that the best way to remove it was either to cut off the head or the flight, and then put it through. This was gonna hurt a lot. It wasn't gonna help that the arrow in his shoulder pretty much meant that he only had one hand he could use to pull the arrow free. He was going to have to find a way to hold the arrow in place while he cut through it. In addition, the only thing nearby that was suitable for cutting was the dagger that had been wielded by the elf, and that had a thrusting blade rather than a cutting blade. For a moment he considered his options. If he thrust the dagger down hard through the shaft of the arrow, he might be able to cut off the end in one fell swoop and suffer only minimal pain. He rejected the idea almost immediately. If he did it that way, the shaft was likely to fray and splinter, and when he tried to pull the arrow free, it would leave splinters in his leg that would bother him for the rest of his life. No, he had to think of something else. The Legion of the Dead had carried serrated blades. They would be ideal for cutting, if he could find one. Reyes looked around, looking more towards the moat and the nearby scaling ladders than anywhere else. The Legion of the Dead would have kept attacking until the magic that had sustained their unlives had run out. Then they had fallen wherever they had been standing. Most had gotten into the castle by that time, but once the castle had fallen and the Legion had died, their lifeless bodies had been ejected from the castle, thrown off the tops of the walls where they had fallen into the moat or onto the ground just beyond. Their swords, though, tended to remain where they had originally dropped them. For the most part, that would be inside the castle. He would have to look elsewhere. The soldiers in the blue uniforms must have been armed with something. Reyes began to crawl slowly over to the nearest blue-clad body, which fortunately wasn't all that far away. Then he began to check through the weaponry the elf had been carrying. There was a sword, and it had a serrated blade, ideal for cutting, but it was a bit large and unwieldy. Reyes also found a small dagger, similar to the one the looter had carried, except that this also had a serrated blade. Reyes shivered as he thought about the pain he was about to subject himself to. He took the dagger and just rested it on his leg for a moment, trying to build up the courage. If only Mangloss had taught him a spell that would help him fight the pain. He hesitated. He knew he had to do something to remove the arrow, but it already hurt so much that the thought of even more pain stayed his hand. Eventually, Reyes gritted his teeth and slowly drew the blade across the shaft of the arrow. The agony was unbelievable. He dropped the dagger immediately, leaned back, and squinted as the pain flooded through him. Then, as it subsided, he took the dagger in his hand and tried again. Every stroke of the blade caused the arrow to vibrate and caused more waves of agony to shoot up his leg. He almost began to wish he was dead. It seemed to take an unbelievable amount of time, but eventually, and with great relief, Reyes finally cut the flight from the arrow, and it dropped to the ground. Reyes took several deep breaths, building himself up for the next part of the task. He dropped the dagger and took careful hold of the arrow's head, closing his eyes in expectation of even more pain. He counted slowly to 3, promising himself that he would begin to pull at the end of the count. The length of time between 2 and 3 seemed inordinately long, and even when he got to 3, he still hesitated. Then finally he built up enough resolve to pull. He pulled as hard as he could with all his harpy's strength, all the time trying to ignore the pain that was shooting through his body as he tugged. The arrow refused to budge. As strong as he was, it just wouldn't come free. It was as if the blood that had congealed around the wound was acting like glue, holding the shaft in place. All that work, all that effort, and all that pain, and he had nothing to show for it. Reyes leaned back on the ground, out of breath with the pain. He needed to think about the problem. He couldn't pull the arrow free with conventional methods, but maybe the solution could be found in magic. The shafts of these arrows were made of wood. Maybe he could burn the shaft. It would hurt. The pain would be intense, and it might even cause him to lose consciousness again. But it would be one sudden surge of pain, and then the relative relief of being finally free of the arrow. Reyes resolved to do the deed quickly before he changed his mind. He closed his eyes and concentrated, gathering as much power as he could into himself and tried to focus it on the index finger of his good hand. Slowly, the feeling of power reached a crescendo. Reyes touched the sawn-off end of the arrow with his impaled finger and uttered the single word, "Immolate." The shock and sudden accompanying pain caused Reyes to jerk back suddenly. There was a loud scream, and it took him a moment to realise that it was he who was screaming. It was all Reyes could do to try and stay conscious. His finger had ignited the arrow shaft and burst through the entire length of the arrow in less than a second. It cauterized the wound as it went and turned the wooden shaft of the arrow into just so much black ash. The metallic head of the arrow had nothing to hold it in place and fell harmlessly to the ground. The worst was over. Reyes reached for a water bottle from the same corpse that he had gotten the dagger from and sloshed it over the wound. He didn't want to heal it and leave any ash behind inside his leg. That could prove nearly as bad as splinters. Running water through his wound still hurt, but there was also a soothing feeling of the coolness of the water. The final thing Reyes did to fix his leg was the heal spell. Again he gathered power into himself, gathering it this time in the palms of his hands. Then, once he felt he was ready, he clasped his palms over the entrance and exit wounds on his leg and pushed the power into his calf. When he moved his hands away, the wound in his leg had all but vanished. There was a reddish tinge to the new flesh that made the area look tender, but that would fade with time. The pain itself had gone with it, leaving only memories of just how much it had hurt. Slowly, reluctant to put any real weight on the foot, Reyes climbed to his feet. Then he experimented, putting more and more pressure on the damaged leg, until he was sure that the wound had fully healed. Reyes was still in pain. There was an arrow lodged in his shoulder that he wouldn't be able to remove in the same way, because the arrowhead would be left in his body. There was also his broken wing. He couldn't do anything about his wing, but he did think about trying to fix his shoulder. He clasped the shaft of this arrow with his good hand. The pain was bad, but not as harsh as the pain in his leg had been. Then he pulled. This arrow wasn't as hard to move as the one in his leg had been, although it did feel as if it was tearing the muscle tissue of his shoulder as he pulled it free. It came out very slowly, resisting the whole way. By the time the arrow was free of the wound, Reyes had suffered more pain than he had ever thought possible. "I never want to go through this again," he muttered to himself. Another quick heal spell, and his shoulder, like his leg, was as good as new. He patted himself on the shoulder a few times, checking the spot where the wound had been for any vestiges of pain. There was nothing. His arm felt as good as it had when he had woken up that morning. Now that he was mobile again, he was free to think about Gagara. If she had been watching the battle as Reyes had suggested she'd do, she would probably be in the castle right now. She would be sitting on a wall or something, wondering what had happened to him and fearing the worst. He needed to get into the castle as quickly as possible to put her mind at rest. Almost without thinking, he began to stretch his wings with the intent of flying to the top of the battlements and jumping down the other side. The sudden pain from his wings seemed mild in comparison to the pain he had had in his leg that morning, but it put to rest any ideas he had about flying. Briefly, Reyes glanced across the field to the trees in which he had been perched earlier that morning. It was just possible that Gagara would still be over there. Then he began to make his way towards the main gates of the castle. Fortunately, the castle gates had been left open by the victors shortly after the castle had fallen.